After successfully hosting the G20 in 2016, China calls on the membership in Hamburg to champion for an open world economy. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. China strengthened its position as a global leader at this month's G20 Summit in Hamburg, Germany, while the United States took measures to withdraw from the world stage. Chinese President Xi Jinping stressed the benefits of globalization, free trade and economic growth, and embraced China's role in tackling climate change. US President Donald Trump deepened the rift between the US and the other 19 member countries with his decision to leave the Paris Climate Change Accord. The group isolated Trump by declaring the international deal, quote, irreversible. China also presented itself as a partner to Germany, and together the two industrial powerhouses could pick up the leadership baton that the US is accused of dropping. To discuss all of this, joining us from Beijing is Shindo Xu. He's a political analyst with China Radio International. Here with us in the studio is Andrew Small. He's a senior transatlantic fellow with the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund. From London, we're joined by Linda Yu. She is an adjunct professor of economics at the London Business School and author of China's Growth, the Making of an Economic Superpower. And Douglas Powell is the vice president for studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Shindo, these are the days when we see many reports, many analysts writing about a changing world, an evolving world. When you consider President Trump's America First policy and the seeming reluctance on the part of the United States to engage internationally, does this give a country like China the opportunity to take up that leadership mantle?
Well, I think it is just an opportunity. I'm not sure like China is ready to play a global leadership role, but you know, the American first policy and American looking inward does give its allies and other countries alike a moment to pause and think about their own future, a future global system, you know, where China will definitely play a very important role. And at what degree and what kind of role China will continue to play, I think is not entirely clear. But what is clear is like China will continue to push forward for globalization and free trade because it benefits from that a lot. And I believe in so. And there's no debate in China whether globalization is good or not bad. So in that respect, I'm pretty sure China will continue to do what it can.
Douglas, shortly after the Second World War, there was a whole host of institutions put into place. You get the United Nations, for instance, the World Bank, NATO. There were a number of multilateral agreements, conventions. Are they still as relevant as they used to be, or are we seeing their influence eroded to some extent?
Well, you're referring to the Bretton Woods institutions,
right,
which were decided by the small number of countries back in 1944 and 45. The IMF, World Bank, there's a long list of these institutions, which have functioned very importantly. But as the world's economies have grown, the few that put the Bretton Woods system together are now joined by many others, including China, India, South Africa, long list of success stories. And they need to play a bigger role in the institutions we have. I'm doing a project right now where I'm calling for a new Bretton Woods, which would have us go back and revisit the institutions that have been gradually adjusting to these changes and take a more radical look at how we need to restructure the international organizations generally. Now, this comes at a bad time in that the Trump administration is pulling back from all of these activities rather than providing the traditional American role of leadership.
When you say a new Bretton Woods, isn't that already changing? Because we have an organization like the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is Chinese-led.
Right.
Some would say a counter to the World Bank.
I don't think it's a counter to it. I think it's a supplement, and it's operating according to principles that have long been established by the World Bank on transparency, non-corruption, things like that. But at the same time, it also improves on some of the World Bank experience. The World Bank is a highly bureaucratized institution with too many votes by too many members of the board. And one of the things that Jin Liqun has done in taking over the AIIB is introduce much more expedited leadership roles. for the member countries. And I think most people have agreed already that this has been a real improvement.
Linda, what is your view on China's emergence as an international power? Do you see a time coming very soon when China will be setting the international agenda, that possibly something that was done previously by traditional power centers in Washington, in Europe?
I think China's stepping in where the United States is pulling back. I don't see China setting the agenda per se, but I think we are entering an era where multipolar decision-making is more likely to be the norm than it was in the past, where a lot of decisions did come from Washington, led by the United States. And of course, Europe is the world's biggest economic bloc, but they'd always had a problem answering the Henry Kissinger question, which is, in Europe, who do you call? But I think Europe is also, in terms of institutions, at least in the Eurozone, creating more of that. And I think you saw that very much in the G20 Summit, where President Xi Jinping of China worked together with Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany. The two of them obviously had to work together because the G20 was previously hosted by China. This time it was hosted by Germany. But they set the agenda, and they very much went for promoting global trade, getting fighting protectionism back in the communique, which wasn't the case when the trade ministers of the G20 met, and they couldn't come to agreement on climate change. But in terms of the other issues, I think that kind of leadership, China in partnership with Europe, is probably going to play a bigger role than what we've seen in the past. And it makes sense. Biggest economic bloc in the world is the EU. China is the world's second biggest economy. And if the United States continues to pull back in different areas, I think you will see these other economic powers step in into that void.
Andrew, do you think that China is taking up this leadership mantle with a little bit of reluctance here? I mean, we heard President Xi Jinping tell us on more than one occasion that China is still a developing economy. And as Xindo Xu just pointed out a moment ago, China is a country that doesn't want to take up that role of global leadership right now. Do you have a sense that that might be changing?
No, I mean, if anything, I think there was this sort of flush of enthusiasm after Xi Jinping's Davos speech, for instance, and a view that perhaps China was going to step up and take on a significantly different role in responsibility for kind of the future of globalization and being a defender of globalization, as he'd suggested. I think in the intervening period, there has actually been, in terms of practical actions taken on China's part, somewhat more caution. I mean, certainly you had the Belt and Road Summit, which was one important initiative. But I think you saw at the G20, you saw at the EU-China Summit, you saw a degree of kind of, in some areas, stepping back to talk about China as a developing country, which I think for some people is code language for China's not going to step in to fill the sort of space that was occupied by the United States and is still going to tread quite carefully. So I think from some of the other partners, including the Europeans at the moment, I don't think people necessarily see China stepping in to do anything substantially different just yet, even if it is playing an important role in kind of holding together the sort of consensus that you saw in Hangzhou last year, and the fact that you didn't see all the countries in Hamburg moving in very different directions, which was a real concern. I think China and the Europeans and others have still been able to underpin some of the shared agenda that's been there for a pro-free trade, pro-globalization agenda. But I mean, there are others stepping up too. You just saw the biggest free trade agreement in the world reached between the EU and Japan, for instance, as well. So I think there's a number of countries that are having to step up in different ways in a more challenging context in dealings with the United States.
Xindo, let's look at one of the issues where China has taken a leadership role. It may have been thrust into taking a leadership role, but it is certainly leading, and that is climate change. China was one of the prime sponsors of the Paris Accord and is moving ahead with development of renewable energy resources and technologies. The United States, as we know, is now out of that Paris Accord. Is China going to set the agenda where climate change is concerned?
Well, I'm not sure China is going to set the agenda, but certainly China is in the leadership role position, let's say, simply because on one hand it has, aspires to be a big power with responsible power in the world. And also, if you look at it domestically, China is simply following its own blueprint, basically by reducing the consumption of coal and other fossil fuel to reduce, say, air pollution. This is something it must do. So it has little to do with, say, climate change or, say, Paris Agreement. If you look at the investment, of course, renewable energy, China is the largest investor. And if you look at the experiment, for example, like in Qinghai province, the province lives on renewable energy for 7 days, just a couple of weeks ago. And also, China, in the past 5 years, China has reduced the consumption of dirty coal by 40%. So these actions are very impressive, and I think China will continue to do so. Somehow China is being pushed into the leadership role simply because it's the largest emitter of carbon dioxide, and it has to do so to take measures to reduce the emission. So now it's in a position, and I think China will continue to do so if it's demanded, if it's asked to do more.
Douglas, if we look at another issue, let's take trade, where the United States has traditionally played a huge role around the world. It's now pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. President Trump talks about imposing tariffs on steel imports from Europe, on other imports coming into the country, especially from China. Is the United States becoming more protectionist, and how will that affect its influence around the world?
I think you have to say the U.S. is becoming protectionist. It's the avowed policy of the new administration. This has been first time since 1929-30 that we've done this. It was disastrous last time we did it. Hopefully the world will continue to have things like this recent Japanese and EU agreement on economic partnership that will keep the momentum. They say, trade is a thing like a bicycle. If you don't keep moving forward, you fall over. And the Trump step toward protectionism is a big slowing down of that bicycle. We need the other parties in the world, and I hope China will be part of this, to keep the momentum going.